What are randomized controlled trials, and what can we learn about nutrition from them? Let's science it. Hey, welcome to Nourishable. I'm Dr. Lara, and I like root beer. Sweet, with more depth of flavor than other pops like colas. But pop, as this Canadian says, or soda as most Americans call it, has a pretty bad reputation when it comes to health, especially for metabolic diseases like type 2 diabetes. Does drinking pop cause type 2 diabetes? The best way to answer this question would be to design a randomized controlled trial. In this type of study, researchers assign one group of people to a test exposure, say soda drinking, and another group of people to a control exposure, say carbonated water. Or here in the northeastern US where I live, we call it seltzer. That would make this an intervention study. The researchers are assigning which participants get the soda and which get the seltzer. Each group of people drink their assigned drinks for a designated period of time. And then at the end, the researchers determine if anyone developed type 2 diabetes. Essentially, the scientists can see whether more people in the soda drinking group developed diabetes compared to the water control group. Since the only difference between the two groups is whether they drank soda, then the scientists can gain insight into whether soda drinking caused type 2 diabetes. There's that word cause, something that we're always interested in, but oh so elusive to actually prove in nutrition research. There are a few more characteristics of this study design that are important to help us gain insight into whether an exposure causes an outcome. And they're all laid out in the full name Randomized, Double-Blind, Placebo-Controlled Trial. Try saying that 3 times fast.
Randomized double-blind placebo-controlled trial, randomized double-blind placebo-controlled trial, randomized double-blind placebo-controlled trial.
First, randomized. This means that the study participants are randomly assigned to whether or not they're in the soda drinking group or the seltzer group. This can be as simple as drawing names out of a hat. Random assignment is important because it helps reduce bias. For example, if the researchers decided to put everyone who liked root beer in the soda group and everyone who didn't like root beer in the seltzer group, then we'd have systematically created our groups based on one characteristic. It may seem silly, but who knows? Root beer preference could be important. Maybe everyone who likes root beer carries a certain gene that impacts their susceptibility to diabetes. Our goal is for the two groups to be as similar as possible to help isolate the impact of soda on diabetes. Randomization helps to balance the participant characteristics between the test and control group. Next, double-blind. Blind here refers to whether you know you're in the soda group or the seltzer group. Double is referring to the two roles in the study, the researchers and the participants. Double-blinded then means neither the researchers or the participants know who's in what group.
Delicious. Notes of oak and raspberry.
Now, why is that important? It's all about trying to reduce bias. When studies are only single-blinded, they run the risk of researchers influencing the participants.
Don't you just feel your blood sugar rising?
Or the participants influencing the researcher.
Doing the do. I can feel my blood sugar rising.
Things get even muddier if no one is blinded.
Wow, I can see your blood sugar rising.
Whoa, I can feel the dew in my veins. How high is my blood sugar?
175 milligrams per deciliter and rising.
I think I can make it go even higher.
And finally, placebo controlled. A placebo is a version of your test product that is indistinguishable from the real thing and biologically inert. Placebo controls are critical so that you have something to compare your test group to that is hopefully identical in every way except for your test exposure. In our case, soda. So if you're running a trial to test a new drug, it can be pretty easy to create a placebo pill that is the exact same size, shape, and color. And your participants would have no idea whether they're taking the drug or the control. Things get a bit more complicated in nutrition.
Whoa, worst soda ever.
So sometimes in nutrition, we just have to pick something to use as our control, even though it's not a perfect placebo. So why bother with an imperfect placebo? It's so that we can measure the placebo effect. In research, it's well established that a participant can experience real benefits from a placebo that can't be attributed to the placebo's properties, and therefore are derived from the participant's belief.
I just know this is going to make me feel better.
Also, when participants are involved in a study, it usually entails other activities, like interacting with friendly researchers or paying more attention to their food intake. So we want to make sure that both our test and placebo groups get the same experience to help isolate the impact of soda drinking on diabetes. Randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled trials are the gold standard in research because they are the best study designs for reducing bias and isolating the impact of an exposure on an outcome. We can get the closest to understanding whether sugary drinks cause type 2 diabetes with this kind of study. Though, as I've alluded to, things get a bit more complicated in practice. Let's take a look at this study published in the journal Nutrients. A team of researchers from UC Davis wanted to investigate the impact of drinking beverages sweetened with high fructose corn syrup on insulin sensitivity and liver fat. They were interested in these outcomes because reduced insulin sensitivity is a step towards developing type 2 diabetes, and liver fat accumulation occurs in a condition that often exists alongside diabetes called non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, or NAFLD for short. So they recruited 85 healthy young adults in their study and divided them into 4 beverage groups. These groups differed by the proportion of daily calories derived from high fructose corn syrup. Their 0% energy beverage was their control, which was sweetened with aspartame. Then there was a 10% daily energy drink, a 17.5% energy drink, and a 25% energy drink. So in this last group, a full quarter of the day's calories came from the sweetened beverage. Participants drank 3 of their assigned beverages a day for 15 days. To measure insulin sensitivity, the researchers took blood tests while the participants drank a glucose-sweetened beverage, and used an MRI machine to take pictures of the liver to measure liver fat. These blood and liver imaging tests were done at the beginning and at the end of the study so that researchers could determine whether there was a change from baseline. After 2 weeks, they found that the groups with the higher intakes of high fructose corn syrup had larger declines in insulin sensitivity and accumulated greater amounts of liver fat. Lower insulin sensitivity and more liver fat are both factors that contribute to the development of type 2 diabetes and NAFLD. Since this study had 3 increasing levels of high fructose corn syrup drinks than the control, they could evaluate a dose-response relationship. This is the idea that if a certain exposure really causes an outcome, then higher levels of that exposure should cause an even greater change in the outcome. And that's what they found here. Participants who drank more concentrated high fructose corn syrup drinks had even worse insulin sensitivity and more liver fat. So that sounds pretty compelling. Now can we say that drinking soda causes type 2 diabetes? Well, still not quite. First off, because this study didn't measure type 2 diabetes development. Instead, they measured insulin sensitivity and liver fat, 2 outcomes that are along the path towards diabetes development, but not actual diabetes. This is quite common in nutrition research trials because many conditions that we're interested in take several years or even decades to develop, like type 2 diabetes, but also cardiovascular disease and some types of cancer. It can be prohibitively expensive to run a study for that long, not to mention unrealistic to expect participants to stick to their assigned drinks for that long.
Year 34, day 282 of test drinking.
Oh, do I have to?
There are a few other things about this design that prevent us from making really strong causational conclusions. Note that this study wasn't randomized in the traditional sense, aka participant IDs were not drawn out of a hat, but rather the groups were balanced by the investigators. So here's the thing. There are tons of factors that swirl together to impact insulin sensitivity and liver fat, like age, sex, body mass index, and blood cholesterol. Instead of drawing names out of the hat and just hoping that their 4 groups were evenly distributed across these factors, the researchers created 4 groups that were evenly matched for these characteristics. Given that this was a relatively small sample size, I think this was an appropriate approach, but it does mean that this study was not a randomized study and may have introduced bias, so it weakens our ability to make causational conclusions. The other thing that I'd like to draw your attention to is the aspartame sweetened control drink. The researchers needed to create a placebo control that was indistinguishable from the high fructose corn syrup drinks. So they couldn't just use a seltzer water control like I did in my made-up study. However, there's controversy about whether artificially sweetened drinks with aspartame are actually biologically inert. Some research points towards potential interactions between artificially sweetened drinks and sweet taste priming appetite hormones, and impacts on the microbiome. And let me tell you, the microbiome is the hottest area of nutrition research, and it seems to impact everything. Metabolism, immunity, inflammation, the list goes on. In this study, the researchers hypothesized that it was both the influence of glucose, fructose, and energy from the high fructose corn syrup sweetened drinks that would impact their outcomes. So the calorie-free aspartame control was a good choice, though, like many nutrition studies, an imperfect placebo. Ultimately, we want to use the findings from a randomized controlled nutrition trial to make recommendations about what to eat in real life. Sometimes the context of real life is different from the fabricated research environment. In this study, the researchers told the participants that their beverages contained a fluorescent marker that could be measured in the urine to confirm that they were actually drinking all of their assigned beverages. This did yield super high compliance. But would humans drink these amounts of sweetened drinks in real life if they weren't being watched? A big challenge in nutrition research is that just the mere act of measuring can change your outcome. This real-life context idea may be an even greater limitation in other studies. Say, for example, studies where the participants actually lived at the lab for a whole month and all their food was prepared for them. Can we necessarily assume that when humans are free living in the world, that they would follow the diet the same way when they have to prepare it themselves? Overall, randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled trials are the best kinds of studies for getting insight into whether a particular exposure causes a particular outcome. They're designed to reduce bias and isolate the impact of the exposure on the outcome compared to a control. For those reasons, they live near the top of our hierarchy of evidence. In practice, it's super challenging to design a perfect randomized controlled trial in nutrition. Often the outcomes we're interested in take a long time to develop. Humans are super variable creatures, and the perfect placebo controls are really tricky to come by. Plus, research environments don't always match the context of real life. Despite these limitations, we can still learn a lot about nutrition from these trials. As a nutrition news consumer, it remains important to tune your science spidey sense to prickle if you hear really strong causational statements. A great way to make a scientist bristle is if headlines say that their study proves that eating X causes disease Y. We can't make an unequivocal causal statement from just one study on its own, but rather we need to see if this finding is consistent in other studies too. That's what science tastes like. Thanks for tuning in to Nourishable. Check out the video description for links to the study if you really want to dig into the details, plus my whole video series on the hierarchy of evidence. And if you value this content, help support the channel by sponsoring Nourishable on Patreon. We'd be oh so grateful for that cup of coffee while reading randomized double-blind placebo-controlled trials. Though hopefully we wouldn't be blinded when drinking the coffee, because that could get messy. Be sure to subscribe to stay up to date on all things nutrition.